In 2002, a team of former Medal of Honor devs founded a little studio named Infinity Ward and began working on what would become one of the biggest video games of all time. Released in 2003, the original Call of Duty quickly scored critical acclaim despite only being available on PC. Infinity Ward's publishing partner Activision clearly saw promise in this new game and greenlit a sequel. In 2005, Call of Duty 2 released and helped bring even more acclaim to the fledgling franchise. Between the first two games and an expansion pack being released in back-to-back years, another thing Activision clearly saw in the franchise was money. So while Infinity Ward started taking a crack at making a new game set in the modern era, Activision had to find a new studio to develop Call of Duty 3. Enter Treyarch Studios. Now known solely as a first-person shooter developer, they didn't start off that way. The studio was founded in 1996 by Peter Achman and Dogen Kosu, and worked on games ranging from Dreamcast NHL games to even a game based on the movie Minority Report. After acquiring the studio in 2001, Activision put Treyarch in charge of developing the tie-in games to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. Amidst all the web swinging, Treyarch made their first Call of Duty and released it in 2006. While Call of Duty 3 wasn't as well received as the other games in the series so far, it was still a solid enough entry that Activision put them in charge of developing Call of Duty 5 with a 2008 release date attached. Infinity Ward then upped the ante in 2007 with the release of the original Modern Warfare. From the multiplayer to the campaign, this title pushed Call of Duty into the 21st century and left many competitors in the dust. More than just a modern reskin of previous titles, high sales and critical reception made Modern Warfare a benchmark for first-person shooters at the time, and rendered the World War II shooters of old outdated. So, I can understand if some were to take a look at Call of Duty World at War and think it too a step backwards. With modern military shooters being new on the market in 2008, none of the same old wouldn't cut it. Whether by coincidence or by intention, Treyarch seemed to know which way the winds were shifting and knew they couldn't release just another World War II shooter. Taking a step back from the more heroic Saving Private Ryan-esque storylines previous titles had gone for, World at War's goal is to feel as dangerous and haunting as possible. If Infinity Ward could make the quintessential modern military shooter, then Treyarch could deliver the quintessential World War II shooter, and help continue a trend that would signal Call of Duty's golden era. Working on the same engine that Infinity Ward developed for Modern Warfare, Treyarch opened up the hood and got to work. While Modern Warfare surprised with its scale, World at War would surprise with graphic brutality. For the first time in the series, enemy soldiers would lose limbs, showcasing the bloody reality of 20th century warfare. That, along with certain destructible environments, made World at War a harrowing journey through the Second World War, and it's fondly looked back on today as a gold standard for how to present historical events, something later into this series would struggle with. While I think the studio has fallen from grace in recent years, there's no denying the quality of this campaign, even if certain parts do feel like a reskin of Modern Warfare at times. So, from the Pacific Islands to the heart of Germany, let's dig into one of Call of Duty's most memorable campaigns. Welcome to Treyarch's vision for a world at war. The campaign is split between two different fronts of the war, jumping back and forth between perspectives. For cohesion purposes, I'll cover them one at a time, starting with the American campaign in the Pacific. We begin in August 1942 as Private Miller on Bacon Island. Miller and his squad have been taken prisoner by the Japanese and are being subjugated to interrogation and torture. Right as he's about to be executed, a squad of Marines arrives to rescue him. They're led by Corporal Roebuck and Sergeant Sullivan, and together the squad fights their way off the island. As opposed to Modern Warfare, there's no tutorial mission to allow the player to get a feel for things before being thrown right into the thick of it. Certain mechanics from Modern Warfare do return, such as the ability to shoot through soft materials, which Sullivan orders you to do during the battle to take out a machine gun. As first levels go, it's a pretty standard affair. The things that make this stand out is the brutality of some of the Japanese tactics. From their interrogation methods to playing dead before launching an ambush, the Japanese are a fearsome enemy not to be taken lightly. Like Crew Expendable in Modern Warfare, this does a great job setting the tone for the entirety of the game. We then jump 2 years later to September 1944, where the Marines are assaulting Peleliu Island. Known as one of the toughest battles the Marines participated in, the game doesn't slouch when it comes to the beach landing. Bodies float in the water, you can't sprint through it, and enemy fire rains down from everywhere. The game has to give you command of missile strikes from the US destroyers off the coast to allow any sort of progress, leaving stunned, shell-shocked soldiers in your way. Moving through the enemy emplacements, the squad is shocked when Sergeant Sullivan is suddenly killed by a Japanese soldier out of nowhere. Thus is the suddenness and brutality of war, and the cutscenes showcase the staggering number of casualties each side suffered throughout the battles. But even the death of the squad leader doesn't mean the Marines can rest. With Roebuck now in command, he leads the Marines through the jungles to flank around the Japanese and capture their airbase, where anti-aircraft emplacements have made it difficult for US planes to perform air support and drop in supplies. The Marines assault the airfield, and Private Miller is given command of a flamethrower to help root out enemy forces. While the flamethrower has been available in other CoD campaigns, I'd contend that it's nowhere near as effective as it is in this one. Not to say the weapon itself isn't balanced well or anything in other games, but the brutality of using a weapon like this against infantry is shown off perfectly here. Maybe the flames burn too bright or something in other games and it obscures your view, but something about the way these Japanese soldiers writhe around trying to put out the fire on top of their screams just really sells how horrible a death this has to be, and the entirety of the next mission is pretty much dedicated to just nailing that point home. Sometimes I think as gamers we can forget that in many of these games we're shooting at enemy units that are designed to look human and instead just see them as the enemy. While Call of Duty occasionally throws things at you like drones and robots, especially in the future-centric titles, the historical-based games are representing real armies that actually fought and men who really died, even if we are playing fictional characters in the cast for story purposes. That's why when games like Vanguard play fast and loose with history, I get a little mad, because they're not really trying to honor a historical event and those that were there, they're just trying to make money. Treyarch, to me, often has always been a little over the top of their violence, and I think the fact that they often have a content filter to turn out the worst of that is proof of it. So usually I do turn the worst of that violence off, as I don't need to see people's heads explode. But for World at War, I kept it on. Not only are sights such as burning enemies hard to watch, but enemies also degrade more the larger caliber your bullets are, which CoD titles don't usually bother with. After capturing the airfield and taking out mortar teams, the Marines push further into the jungle and Miller is given a Browning M1919 machine gun, which is a big boy. While it uses the same ammo that the M1 Garand does, the fire rate of this beast of machine gun tears through enemy troops. Often these were strapped to tanks and aircraft, but they could be removed and handheld with some modifications. And with this thing at your side, anyone downrange to you is in for a bad time. I was shocked when I realized how badly the Japanese forces were being cut up with this thing. Severed limbs, giant blood splatters, and flying helmets were everywhere when I started shooting. Having played so many of these games now, I was genuinely surprised by how brutal using this weapon was, as even using heavier weapons in other games only ever caused enemies to simply keel over and die, forget about mutilating them. And then you move into the caves, fighting in close quarters to clear out to the point, an installation on top of a hill that had rained artillery and machine gun fire down on the American forces since they landed on the island. With the point captured, the Battle of Peleliu is over, but the worst is still ahead of the Marines. Before we get to that though, we have one of our two vehicle missions in the game. Clearly taking inspiration from Modern Warfare's Death from Above mission, Black Cats follows a similar outline but into PBY Catalina instead of an AC-130. The crew performs gun runs on Japanese transport ships and picks up wounded American sailors in the water after the US fleet is attacked en route to Okinawa. While not quite as memorable as Death from Above, the game does well with maintaining a tense atmosphere, as this crew's more directly in the action than the AC-130 crew. There's even a great moment at the end when the Japanese fighters have you dead to rights right when you run out of ammo, but you're saved at the last moment by the American planes. A little cheesy and predictable, but the atmosphere sucks you in enough to stay immersed. Moving on as we cut to May 1945. The Marines are now assaulting Okinawa, the toughest campaign in the Pacific Theater and instrumental in the Allies' plan to eventually attack mainland Japan itself. Like before, it's much of what we're accustomed to at this point. The Marines root out the entrenched Japanese forces from their caves and bunkers, burning and shooting everything in sight. Finally, they reach Shuri Castle, which appears deserted. However, the Japanese have laid a trap for the Marines, who are low on supplies. In one of the more frustrating levels of the game, enemy troops just keep spawning and spawning and spawning, forcing you to keep moving up to deal with the monster closets. The Marines make their way to the main courtyard where they come across Japanese troops attempting to surrender. Unsurprisingly, it turns out to be a trap, and certain squad mates end up getting killed. Depending on who the player shoots, you can either save Roebuck or Private Plonsky. I ended up saving Plonsky just because that's who I was closest to, and Roebuck is killed by a hidden grenade. I do like that while the campaign doesn't have any major choice-based segments like in later titles, they still sprinkle in small choices here and there, like which squad mate do you want to save or which flanking route do you take. So after fighting off waves of enemies and calling in artillery fire, the Marines take Shuri Castle, or at least what remains of it after the bombardment. And with that significant victory in the battle achieved, the American campaign ends. I'll admit at first I was a little underwhelmed by the American side of things in this game. The Marine characters don't really stand out all that much and are more or less mouthpieces to shout commands during combat. Kiefer Sutherland lends his voice to Roebuck and attempts to add a little something to his character, but there's just not enough for him to really leave an impact. What did stick with me by the end was the brutality of the combat. From the flamethrower, booby traps, bonsai charges, and just overall a lot of close-quarters combat, the American campaign is a tough and brutal slog. While it takes historical liberties here and there, it at least makes you know that these are serious things you're playing through, and not to take it too much for granted, and I love that the game has the guts to do that. But we're only halfway through. On the other side of the world, rewinding back to 1942, the Nazi war machine pushes through Russia, as Hitler wants the resources the Soviet Union could provide him. Bogging down their advance is the siege of Stalingrad, leaving scores of people dead day after day. It's here we begin playing as Dmitry Petrenko, a private in the 62nd Rifle Division of the Red Army. He's the only one in his squad left alive after a massacre by German forces, or at least that's what he thinks at first. One of the other soldiers wakes up and enlists his help to complete his mission. This is Sergeant Victor Reznov, played fabulously by the legendary Gary Oldman. His mission is to kill General Heinrich Amsel, a German commander ordering the execution of Russian soldiers during the battle. Potentially taking inspiration from All Gillied Up, this opening level in Stalingrad takes the idea of a sniper level in a different direction by having it be set in the built-up and under-siege city, as opposed to the abandoned and decaying outskirts of Chernobyl. Together, the pair must fend off both enemy squads and enemy snipers as Reznov comments on the destruction surrounding them.
This place, once echoed with conversations of friends and lovers, no longer. Mark my words, comrade. One day things will change. We will take the fight to their land, to their people, to their blood.
It's fitting that this mission is known as Vendetta, as it sets the tone for the entirety of the Russian campaign. While the American levels are more just about taking it to the next checkpoint with your squad intact, the Russian levels hammer in that every dead German, every destroyed tank, and every inch of land forward into Germany is payback for what the Germans did to the Soviet Union and the city of Stalingrad. Once Dmitri and Reznov kill Ansel, we skip forward several years to April 1945 as the Red Army is encroaching on Berlin. It's here in Silo Heights that we meet our third Russian character, Private Chernov. Unlike the American campaign, the Russian characters are much more memorable. As the Red Army marches on Berlin and enacts their revenge, the army mows down everything in their path, showing no mercy. Reznov often celebrates this, even ordering his men to burn crops down to flush out entrenched troops so they can be shot in the back. The player can participate in these acts if they choose, which only draws more and more praise from Reznov. Unfortunately, this lines up historically, as war crimes committed by Russian forces are fairly well known of, and World at War's depiction is actually quite tame in comparison to reality. The only one who seems shocked by these atrocities is Chernov, who Reznov doesn't hesitate to berate when he doesn't show the same level of ruthlessness as his comrades.
Chernov! I am not hearing gunshots!
There is no point, Sergeant. We are already bleeding to death.
Then maybe our friend will help them bleed faster.
Dmitri! Ride on one of the tanks! You have earned the rest. Chernov! You have not. You won!
From controlling a tank, fighting building to building, and even going into subway stations, the Russian forces push further and further into Berlin. I really don't have much to say about the gameplay in these levels. While they never quite reached the same level of graphic violence as the levels set in the Pacific, the March of the Red Army was a beast that couldn't be stopped, and you quickly get caught up in that wave of momentum. Unfortunately for me, that momentum comes to a crashing halt thanks to the wonders of PC gaming. For whatever reason, my game refused to load the last level, which I guess is a known issue that's just never been fixed. So I downloaded the game on my editing laptop, and it actually was running better there until another bug stopped me in my tracks, where Reznov got stuck at the top of the subway and never came to open the door as the tunnel floods. So I had to watch a YouTube video at the end to know what I was missing. It's annoying that technical issues like that kind of ruined 2 playthroughs for me, especially for a game this short. For the footage I was able to capture up until the very last mission, playing the game on regular only takes about 4 hours, so it doesn't stick around long. While annoying though, I kind of don't hold that against the game. One reason is because this is one of 3 games that Treyarch made for Activision in the fall of 2008. One was this, another was Spider-Man: Web of Shadows, and the last was the tie-in game to Quantum of Solace. All 3 of which were released within weeks of one another. Given that their team was spread across 3 games, I can maybe imagine why World at War may have some bugs here and there. I also think mine not being that upset by the bugs is a testament to the overall quality of the game otherwise. The conclusion to the Russian storyline is a satisfying one, as after Reznov has spent the game berating Chernov for being weak, his death on the steps of the Reichstag shocks him out of his revenge-fueled rampage across Europe, opening the door for some excellent character development later.
Which do you think will lead us home? Writing about this war or fighting it?
This wretched Germany in the blood.
No one will ever read this! Dmitri!
Someone should read this.
By the end, the Soviets fight their way to the top of the Reichstag, and Dmitri plants the hammer and sickle atop the building. In the days that followed, Berlin would fall, and the war in Europe would end. And having completed 2 major campaigns in the war, the game sends us off with a final reminder of what it costs to bring peace to a world at war.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby may be restored. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice.
This game certainly isn't perfect, but it's treating the conflict it's trying to represent with an obvious amount of care and respect. That helps any shortcomings like technical glitches or historical inaccuracies come off as not a huge deal, unlike later games that treat the whole conflict like a playground for them to do whatever they want in. Other theaters of the war were considered but cut for time, and that's a shame, as I wouldn't have minded playing more of this. Given that this year marks the 20th anniversary of Call of Duty, I wouldn't mind more remasters of the older campaigns. World at War and a bundle of Black Ops 1 and 2 would make for a great deal, and this game especially could use it, as I forgot how yikes some of these 2008 graphics looked at the time. Even if that doesn't happen, World at War is probably a must-play campaign if you're interested in World War II, or just where Call of Duty has gone in general and how it's evolved throughout the course of 20 years. You might have some issues playing on PC, your results may vary, but backwards compatibility is always an option on Xbox. So while it might feel a little outdated now, it does such a good job of trying to honor the Second World War and those who served in it that it proved that Treyarch certainly had what it took to take the reins from Infinity Ward during their off years and keep the ship afloat. While I'm not a huge fan of the more recent output, back in the day, I'd certainly say it was always safe to bet on black.